This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Good morning, everyone. Bershus the Menahel, Chashva Rabbeim. I want to share with you an idea and a question. I think it's an interesting question. You'll tell me if you think it's a good question. Definitely something worthy to think about. In Tana Devei Eliyahu, in Parak Chaf Hei, the Tana Devei Eliyahu tells us something, we may all be familiar with it. It tells us something that's a chiyuv, an obligation. Now you need to know that when Chazal say that something is a chiyuv, if they say the word chayiv, boy is it a chiyuv. Because there are many things they say that are recommended, and the Shulchan Aruch says you're mechuyev to do it. I'll give you an example. In Shas it says, La'olam yishalem adam parshiyosav v'matzibar. You should always be maver sedra. La'olam. Now, does that mean you have to do it? If I was reading it, la'olam means, always, you should, it's a good idea. The Gemara doesn't say chayiv. The Gemara says la'olam. And the Torah says, sarach. You need to. The Torah doesn't say chayiv. But the Gemara says la'olam. And the Torah says tzarech, comes the Shulchan Aruch chayiv. So that means that when Chazal speak, when they say something is recommended, the way we're supposed to understand that is you need to do it. You have to do it. But imagine if Chazal actually said chayiv. That must be really important. And Tana Devei Eliyahu says, chayiv kol echad ve'echad mi Yisrael lo yimar. That doesn't just say chayiv loymar. If it would have said chayiv loymar, you would have said most people, or almost everybody. But the Chazal go out of their way to say, kol echad ve'echad mi Yisrael. Nobody is exempt. Everyone is mechuyev to say as follows: Masai yagiu masai lamasai avoisai Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov. I'm here. The Avois, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, they're all the way ad l'rakia, and I am obligated to say, no, when are you going to get there? Now, first of all, why would I be obligated to say that? Am I ever going to get there? Is it realistic? I mean, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they were greater than the Vilna Gaon. Am I going to get to the Madrega of the Vilna Gaon? They were greater than Yeshaya Navi, presumably. Am I going to ever be a Navi? I'm not going to be a Navi. So why would I be obligated to say something that will never happen? Furthermore, if Chazal are saying I'm obligated to do this, where does it say I'm obligated to do this? Where? Show me in the Chumash. Where in the Chumash does it say I'm obligated to say, when will I be like Avraham? It says that somewhere? Anybody know a pasuk? Anybody know anywhere? From where do Chazal, it's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that I'm obligated to say, Masai yagiu masai lamasai avoisa Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov? Where does it say that? How do Chazal know that? So I came across a Rabbeinu Yoina. I've seen many ask on this Rabbeinu Yoina. I've seen many approaches to this Rabbeinu Yoina. I'm going to share with you this morning an approach. I think this is the only approach, and if it sounds, how could I say such a thing? Because I found another sefer that Rabbeinu Yoina wrote where he says pshat in the Shari Tshuva. But I've seen many ask on this Rabbeinu Yoina. We know in the hierarchy, in the totem pole, of the severity of mitzvahs and averos, so the most chamor of an avera would be a lav sheish by misa chas v'sham. And then a little bit lower than that is a lav sheish by kares. And then lower than that is a regular lav. And the lowest in terms of oinshim is a mitzvah saseh. We know that if somebody violates a mitzvah saseh, there's no particular punishment ba'olam hazeh. If somebody violates a lav, there's a chiyuv malchus. Somebody violates a lav sheish by misa, there could be capital punishment. If somebody violates a mitzvah saseh, it's severe, but there's no oynish ba'olam hazeh. Maybe bisman shebeis hamikdash kaim, you would bring a carbon, but there's no particular oynish. And yet Rabbeinu Yoina says something very interesting. He says there's something called malois ha'elyonos. Malois ha'elyonos. What are malois ha'elyonos? Malois ha'elyonos are avenues, are realms of avodas Hashem, that even though specifically there's no oynesh not fulfilling it, but the main avenues of avodas Hashem were nimsaru lanu, they were given to us b'mitzvah saseh. Rabbeinu Yonah gives some examples. Malois hayira, shenemar es Hashem aleikecha tira. Yira Shamayim is one of the main avenues of avodas Hashem. Would there be an oynish if somebody wasn't mekayim? There's no particular oynish, but that's ma Hashem aleikecha doirish mincha. It's one of the main things HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from us. Rabbeinu Yonah says, malas ha'ahava, ahavas Hashem. Milos habitachon. Now, if you were making the list of malos ha'elyonos, what would you put as the first milo ha'elyono b'mitzvah saseh? What's the most important mitzvah in the Torah? Again, we're not talking about specific mitzvahs. We're talking about realms, avenues of avodas Hashem. So Rabbeinu Yoina says, and I would have said, number one, the Talmud Torah keneged kulam, malos Talmud Torah. Interesting, Rabbeinu Yoina does not put it first. He puts it second. Number three, says Rabbeinu Yoina, malois leches b'darchei Hashem, going in the ways of Hashem, chesed, shenemar v'halachta b'drachav. That Rabbeinu Yoina puts three. If I was writing the list, I would have put them 1 and 2. Talmud Torah number 1, Gemilas Chasadim number 2. Chafetz Chaim says on the Gemara in Shabbos, Asi dardiki lebeis midrasha. Children came into the beis medrash and they darshin the aleph beis, aleph bina, gimel dalid, gimel dalim. Says the Chafetz Chaim, if they darshin from the beginning of the aleph beis, aleph bina, learn Torah, gimel dalid, gimel dalim. This teaches us that the two most important ways of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, the meat and potatoes, the ikarim and avodas Hashem, are aleph bina, learn Torah, gimel dalid, gimel dalim. Everything else is secondary, the Chafetz Chaim writes. So I would have listed the Milos Ha'elyonos, number 1, Talmud Torah, number 2, Gemilas Chasadim, and yet Rabbeinu Yoina reserves the very first Milo Ha'elyono b'mitzvah saseh. You ready for this? Malos HaBechira. The Milo of Bechira. Shenemar uvacharta b'chayim. Hafla v'fela. Malos HaBechira. What's the mitzvah of Bechira? Did you ever hear of Bechira? I never heard of the Milo of Bechira. You can learn the Rambam and the Sefer HaMitzvahs, all 613 mitzvahs. There is not one mitzvah called Mitzvahs Bechira. What's Mitzvahs Bechira? Look up the Smag, 613 mitzvahs. There's no mitzvah Bechira. Bechira is not a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah. It's something we're maminin, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave a person free choice, that when you do the right thing, it's up to you to do the right thing, and it's up to you to do the wrong thing. It's your choice. Nobody's forcing you. Nobody's compelling you. You know, an amazing thing. To the level that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not interfere with the way we choose to do mitzvahs and averos. You know, Rashi tells us that Yaakov Avinu was going from the south of Eretz Yisrael. He was going to the house of his family, and he passed by the Har Habayis. So Rashi's bothered. Why didn't Hashem remind him? Yaakov Avinu, you know, this is the Har Habayis. You should have davened there. So Rashi says, Ihu lo yahiv date lemehadar. He didn't remember to go back. Hashem's not going to remind him. Says the Sifsei Chachamim, because ein koifin ledvar mitzvah. Think about this. Yaakov Avinu is going to the north of Eretz Yisrael. He's passing by the Har Habayis. It slips his mind for a moment that this is the place that his father and grandfather daven. So would Hashem as much as remind Yaakov Avinu, this is the Har Habayis, and then Hashem will leave to Yaakov Avinu to decide whether he wants to stop or not? No. Ad kidei kach, the Rebbeinu Shalom will not give any reminder. It's totally up to you. That's the mitzvah b'chira. However, Rashi says, once Yaakov Avinu turned around and he took one footstep back, Habala Tahir Messiah Noisai. Once you take the initiative, your siyata d'shmaya could be ad l'rakia, but you always have to take the first step. So there's an idea of b'chira. There's a concept of b'chira. There's no mitzvah of b'chira. There's no malah ha'elyoina of b'chira. What in the world is Rabbeinu Yoina talking about? Maila ha'elyoina uvacharta b'chayim. For many, many years, it bothered me deeply. What's Rabbeinu Yoina talking about? Mailos ha'elyonis nimsur b'mitzvah saseh. There's no mitzvah saseh of b'chira. B'chira is an idea. I want to share with you a very interesting question. We have today Rosh Yeshiva. We had 100 years ago, 500 years ago, we had Achronim. 1,000 years ago, we had a Rashi, Rambam, Rif, Rosh. Before that, we had Gaonim. We had Amoraim. We had Tanoim. We had Nevi'im. And I ask a very challenging question. Could somebody tell me what's the main difference between an Achroin and a Rishain? What's the main difference between a Rishain and a Goin? Between a Goin and an Amoira? In other words, what is greater about a Tana than an Amoira? What did Tanoim have more than Amoraim had? What did Amoraim have more than Rishainim had? Were they bigger masmidim? Was that the nekuda? In other words, what's the nekuda of difference in greatness between the different levels, between a Navi and a Tana, between a Tana and a Amoira? Were they bigger maminim? Did it come from greater emunah? Did it come from greater hasmada? Did it come from greater yira shamayim? What's the nekuda? I mean, it would be worthwhile for us to know that. Rabbi Yerucham writes something incredible. He says the difference between a Tana and an Amoira, the difference between an Amoira and a Goin, the difference between a Rishon and an Achroin, it's not that they were greater Yirei Shamayim. They were, but that's not the nekuda. It's not that they had more Avas Hashem. They did, but that's not the nekuda. It's not that they had more Emunah. They did, but that's not the point. What's the point? He said the point is the same thing with anybody in this world. The most successful people in this world, the wealthiest people, let's say, are they smarter than everybody else? Usually not. Do they work harder than everybody else? Lav dafka. Says Yerucham, what's the nekuda? The adirei haaretz. What's the point? What allows them la'alois? He says a very interesting word. Yazama. Yazama? Never heard of that word. Yazama means ambition. They're more ambitious. They want it more. They have a greater desire for it. They yearn for it. And because they want it deeply, they're able to rise up to a level that other people can't rise up to. And they're not smarter than anybody else. And they don't necessarily work harder than anybody else. Yeah, it helps to be a Baal Kishroin. It helps to work hard. But that's not the nekuda, says Rabbi Yerucham. The nekuda is yazama. The nekuda is ambition, the desire for it. Because if you really want something, nothing will stand in your way. I just saw this week a very powerful idea. Think about it. there was a Karban Pesach, and there were Yidden that were Tameh. And, okay, so you're Tameh, you can't bring the Karban Pesach, so you bring it next year. What are you going to do? You know? If you're not feeling well one day, and you can't make it to Shiur, so you're not going to get the Shiur. You'll get the next year. You're an Oinus Rachmana Patre. They come to Moshe Rabbeinu, and they say, no, what do you mean we're Tameh? Give us an Eitzah. Lama Nigara. Lama Nigara. Don't tell us that we're Tameh. Okay, we're Tameh. But so now what? We're not waiting till next year. There's a mitzvah in the Torah of Karban Pesach. We can't bring it because we're Tameh. So Moshe Rabbeinu, give us a way to be makriv the Karban Pesach. Moshe Rabbeinu said, huh? What can we do? No, Klal Yisrael wouldn't settle for that. There were people who said, don't tell me that we're Tameh and we'll wait till next year. So Moshe Rabbeinu goes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Hashem says, you know what? There's a new mitzvah in the Torah now. There's something called Pesach Sheni. Think about what the Glatstein of Klal Yisrael produced. It produced a mitzvah that didn't exist before. There was no such thing as another opportunity. There was no such thing as Pesach Sheni. But when Klal Yisrael came and said, no, we're not going to take no for an answer, give us an eitzah to come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the Karban Pesach, Moshe Rabbeinu goes to Rebbeinu Shalom, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, Taka, there's something called Pesach Sheni. So you can make a Kavah Chomer. If a mitzvah that never existed before came to being because Klal Yisrael said, Lama Nigara. So imagine a person that has the potential for Gadlus, and they say to the Rebbeinu Shalom, Rebbeinu Shalom, there's a big shas on the shelf. Right now, it's not so easy for me to read a Rashi even. Right now, to go through a whole Tosfos and to understand every line seems to be a little bit difficult. But Rebbeinu Shalom, Lama Nigara, why can't I know it, the whole thing? Why can't I know all the Masechtas? Alachas kama v'kama, the Rebbeinu Shalom will say, okay, give it a shot and I'm going to help you out. I'm sure you're familiar with the well-known Ramban, that after Klal Yisrael came out of Mitzrayim, so Moshe Rabbeinu says, okay, here's what we're going to do. The Rebbeinu Shalom gave us a mitzvah, we're going to build a Mishkan. So Klal Yisrael says, okay, what's the Mishkan? So Moshe Rabbeinu says, you got to build kruvim. So Klal Yisrael said, how do you build kruvim? Well, actually, most people in the world, they would have to go to for training for about 50 years to learn out how to carve the fine details of the kruvim, to be able to take a big slab of gold and produce kaftorim, prachim, flowers. People had to be trained for that for decades and decades. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, okay, Rabbi Isai, who wants to do it? Who wants to do it? Nobody had any clue how to do it. How would anybody know? What were they doing in Mitzrayim? They were building pyramids, big blocks. There was no skill involved at all. They had no training. They weren't an artist. And the pasuk says that who came to Moshe Rabbeinu? Kol ish asher nesa'oi liboi. Anybody whose heart inspired them. And the Ramban explains that there were Yidden that so badly wanted to come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the great mitzvah of building the Mishkan, that they were able to tap into the endless and infinite ability that their neshama had, and summon forth koyach and talent and ability that it would not have been humanly possible. But there's a concept, there's an idea of vayigba liboy bedarchei Hashem. That if a person really wants to come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if a person wants to accomplish in Avodas Hashem, a person wants to accomplish in Torah, they could say, Ribbanu Shalom, I have such a ratzain, I have such a desire, I have such a nesias halev, I'm going to now tap into, because we have to understand, how much koyach does the neshama have? How much ability does the neshama have? It's endless. Vayipach v'yapav nishmas chayim. The Ribbanu Shalom instilled within us a neshama. The neshama is a chelek elokam mimal. It's a, so to speak, a piece of the divine. Which means the ability we have the capability we have is infinite. But it's not easy to access. But through a Ratzain, through a Nesias Halev, through a Tshuka, through Yazama, says Rabbi Rucham, a person can accomplish Lamala Mehasagasai, greater than their ability. Says Rabbi Rucham, the difference between a Tana and a Moira is the Tana had more Yazama, more ambition, more Ratzain to come close to Hashem. Memela, the Rebbeinu Shalom gave much more Siyata D'Shmaya, and they had much more Roichav Lev, and Memela more Emuna, and more Yira, and more Hasmada. And the Amoira had more Yazama than the Rishon. And the Rishon had more ambition than the Achrain. And Rabbi Rucham says the reason why in our generation we seem to have a hard time climbing the Sulam Sharoishay Magia Hashamayma is because we wake up in the morning and we say, okay, I'm learning, what are you learning this year? Bava Basra? Maybe I'll try to learn a few blat. I'll try to understand it with Rashi. Maybe a few Tosfos. I'll try to do well on the test. And that's it. But, says Rabbi Yerucham, when Rashi got up and Rashi said, I'm going to learn and master and know Kol HaTorah Kula. That was the Ratzain of a Rishon. That was the desire of a Rishon. That was the Nesias Lev of the Rishon. Memela they had more Emunah. Memela they had more Siyata D'Shmaya. Rabbeinu Yoina wrote a sefer, it's called Sharei Avodah. In Perek Memtes, Rabbeinu Yoina talks about that a person should aspire to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu always, b'chol levavai, u'b'chol nafshay, u'b'chol ma'odai, in order to achieve the mailos of Avram, Yitzchak, V'Yakov, Moshe, Aaron, David, Shlomo. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, they didn't do more than you could do. They also only served Hashem k'fi hasagas yadam. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, uv'chol yom v'yom yosef oimetz l'hischazek v'lalois mimida lamida u'mimadrega l'madrega. Every day, strengthen yourself to climb higher and higher. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, v'yachmoid, you should desire. V'yichsoif, you should yearn. Lahasig ba'avoida ma'she'ein yadai maseges. Every day you should yearn to reach a madrega that you can't reach. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, v'yivchar ba, you should choose it. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, v'al habechira bilvad yekabel schar ki'ilu hisig chemda. Just by wanting it, you'll be rewarded as if you got there. Because you can't do more. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, why will I be rewarded? Let's say I wake up in the morning and say, Rebbeinu Shalom, I want to know Kol HaTorah Kula. Right now, I'm not holding there. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, I will be rewarded as if I got there. Ki ha-bechira mitzvah saseh. Bechira is a mitzvah saseh. Comes Rabbeinu Yoina, and Rabbeinu Yoina is mechadesh, something that is not found in other Rishonim. That there's a mitzvah in the Torah. It's one of the 613 mitzvahs. The name of this mitzvah is bechira. Today we would call it she'ifais. A she'ifa, a yearning, an ambition for something. And the mitzvah is uvacharta b'chayim. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, even if you never get there, even if you never achieve it, you'll be rewarded, like the Gemara says, Kol misha Allah b'libay lasais mitzvah, mala Allah v'akasuk ilasa. But says Rabbeinu Yoina, not only will be rewarded, mitoich sheyivchar b'amida ahi, v'yavin v'yaskil, HaKadosh Baruch Hu yazer oisai b'ma she'ein yativa yichol lahaseg. If you really choose it and you really want it, you will definitely get there. Now, Putting this back in the Sharei Tshuva, it comes out as follows. The second most important Ma'ila Ha'elyoina is Limud HaTorah. The third most important Ma'ila Ha'elyoina is Gemilas Chasadim. But incredibly, it comes out, there's something perhaps more basic and more fundamental and even more important than learning. Imagine such a thing? Before you open up your Gemara in the morning, there's another mitzvah you have to do. That takes precedence, that comes before. And that is, you got to shoot for the stars. You have to say, Ribono Shel Olam, I want to know the whole Mesivta. I want to know it klar. I want to know it with Rashi. I want to know it with Tosfos. I want to know it with the Rishonim. I want to know it with the Marsha and the Maram Shif and Rabbi Kiva Eger. And I want to know all the Mesechtas. And I want to know Halacha L'Maisa. And I want to be a Yirei Shamayim. I want to be a Baal Midos Toivos Ke'echad Migedolah Olam. It's before you even open up the Gemara in the morning. Before the Maila of Talmud Torah is Mailas HaBechira. You need to shoot for the stars. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter would say he always wanted to be like the Vilna Gaon, so that's why he was like Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. If he would have wanted to be like Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, he said, then he would have been somewhere in between. So this is something that it's worthwhile to think about and to focus on. And when we started with the question, so how do Chazal know? Chayiv Adam Loimar Masai Yagiu Masai Lamasai Avoy Sabram Yisrael. Where does it say you're Chayiv? Where in the Torah does it say you're Chayiv to think that? I believe it's a pasuk in the Chumash, Uvacharta B'Chayim, which according to Rabbeinu Yoina is a mitzvah saseh. And if we have the right to give significance to the order of the mitzvahs that Rabbeinu Yoina lists, it would come out that perhaps this is the most basic of all the mitzvahs saseh. So may HaKadosh Baruch Hu give us all siyata d'shmaya in all of our endeavors, in all of our limudim, and give us siyata d'shmaya that we shoot for the right madregos, and with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's help, we should all grow higher and higher on the sulam shemagia hashamayma bracha v'hatzlacha. Thank you very much.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.